This video answers two things. In a few seconds I'll tell you roughly how much an install will cost, and then after that we'll go over all the most important things that drive that install price up or down. So for the first question, how much will an install cost? Well, we all know that without us looking at your site, the only right answer to how much it costs is it depends. But it depends on what? Well, that's what the second half of the video covers. We'll look at the most important things that drive that cost up or down. So by the end of this video, you'll have a rough idea how much, and you'll also understand, probably better than almost anyone outside the security industry, what factors affect that price the most. So first though, let's deal with the basic question, how much? So these are typical prices. So for a home, 1,500 to 5 grand. For a shop, 2 grand to 10 grand. For a factory, 5 to 50. For a school, 10 to 60. And for an apartment building, 15 to 40. Okay, so what are the main factors that affect that price? Well, first the gear itself. It's pretty important because you'll be relying on it to protect your valuable property and people and hopefully profits for the next few years. So you can think of it as 4 different types of gear available on the market in 2021. First, cheap generic. Now these are knockoffs of the main branded systems. To be honest, we used to install these systems when we first got started, but I'll never go there again. Mainly because of the horrible lack of support when anything goes wrong, and it will. 2. Black box systems. So here you should think Daha and Hikvision. Probably the top sellers in Auckland and 2 of the biggest companies in the world. Now, pretty amazing value for money when you consider what they can provide these days. You know, for less than 5 grand you can get performance that would have been more than 100 grand 20 years ago. Now they're both Chinese with ties to the Communist Party, like any big company there, and that's caused some issues with the US government around cyber security. Now, another word of caution when it comes to these black box brands, if you buy your own gear on the internet, you can run into some awful issues with incompatibility between cameras and recorders, and it can be next to impossible to get the right firmware. So you've been warned. It might seem like a good deal, but it can cause a lot of heartache when you find that the system simply won't perform for you, or you can't even get it going. You're far better off getting gear that comes through into New Zealand through approved channels. Option 3, the third type of gear, is Mobotics. Now this is a brand, a superior German system without any costly software licensing for most people's needs. You don't have to worry about overloading the server because there is no server. Now that's because every camera does all the heavy lifting and processing itself, which keeps load off your network, and for that reason IT departments normally love Mobotics. Now it's about the best image quality going around because of the quality of the German manufactured components. Now a huge part of their selling is their reliability, no moving parts. So as a package, Mobotics is more expensive than the black boxes, but it can be competitive with the server-based model, which we'll talk about in a minute. Now also with Mobotics you need your own lighting because they don't have infrared LEDs. Okay, the fourth option then is server-based. Now there used to be a time when this was the only way you could get decent performance, but the black boxes are now a lot more powerful and can probably do everything you need. Server-based systems can be very expensive, especially if you have to buy a second server for redundancy. And because the hardware company doesn't supply the software, you need to buy software licenses as well as the cameras and the recorders. When you put any new cameras onto the system, it'll cost you not only the cost of the cameras but the cost of additional software licenses. Now the server is also a performance choke point, and it's a single point of failure, unlike Mobotics. Okay, so there's the 4 types of gear. Cheap generic, don't go there. Black box, Daha and Hikvision, great value for money. Mobotics, more expensive but high quality and the great reliability. And the server-based model, which we don't normally go for because it's unnecessary. Okay, a couple other things that can affect the pricing in terms of gear. Monitors. Now in the old days you would have had to have a TV screen to see your cameras, and some people still want this. In my view it's normally a waste of money because in the 2020s everyone has their screen in their pocket, and then you can also access your system on any computer. Now, while we're on huge wastes of money, what about those cameras that move around and zoom in? PTZ, or pan tilt zoom cameras, are known as. Now, these are an expensive waste of money in almost every case, unless you have a human driving them 24/7. So they're great for live operations like crowd control, but for normal day-to-day security, you're way better off with much less expensive fixed lens cameras that just look at the same picture 24/7. While the PTZ is looking left, it can't be looking right, can it? So they're great fun, but they're an expensive toy that's pretty much useless for most security applications. Oh, and remember one of Mobotic's main advantages? No moving parts? Well, a PTZ by definition has lots of moving parts, and moving parts are prone to stop moving, and then what? Okay, so that's the gear. The only other thing I've mentioned about gear is you'll see an option for HD CVI versus IP cameras. Now, we have produced other material about this, but in essence, HD CVI is a way for you to get high definition video over the old style coaxial cabling. Now, as coaxial cabling is disappearing from the world, HD CVI is kind of becoming less and less necessary. It's not as good as IP, and it can be prone to some pretty horrible picture problems when you get interference between channels. So as a general rule, we may offer it as a cheap option if people are looking at a black box like Daha or Hikvision, but generally we don't recommend it, and you're much better off these days getting an IP system, because that sets you up for the future and you'll get far fewer problems and a much neater install, particularly at the recorder end. Okay, so while we're talking about install, cabling is the other big factor that affects the price of your installed system. So in the old days, with cabling, you used to have to run a cable from every camera back to the recorder. Now with IP cameras, that's no longer the case. You just have to get them onto the network. So if you already have structured Ethernet cabling, in other words, if you've got network sockets in the walls throughout your site, these can greatly reduce the amount of cabling and the time and the cost. Now this is typically the case in most schools who've had the SNUPS upgrade. Now if you have old coaxial CCTV cabling, you know, the black stuff that looks like a TV aerial cable and normally has a silver BNC fitting on the end of it, well, this can save you some cost, but not necessarily these days. I mean, you're best to use IP cameras, as I said, because now these can be run over old coaxial cable, but expensive adapters are required on either end of the cable. So in many cases, it's actually cheaper to run Ethernet cable and be done with it. Having said all that, in some cases it's not practical or economic to run new cabling, in which case you can use your old coaxial CCTV cabling to run modern IP cameras on it. Now you might be thinking finally about wireless. All this talk about cabling. The rule is always cable if you can. This is a security system, not a toaster, so you want it to work 100% of the time. A couple other things that may affect the price of the install if we have to use access equipment. So this is a scissor lift or a knuckle boom hire may be required for the job. And of course, there may be some special requirements. We may be required to work after hours, for example. There may be restricted areas. There may be a high need for personal protective equipment. All these sort of special requirements, I'd call them, they may add to the cost of the installation because they make the installation work that much more difficult. So, in summary, when it comes to cost of CCTV in Auckland in the 2020s, the average house is going to be covered for between 2 to 5 grand, shops, factories, schools and apartments anywhere from 2 to 60 grand or more for a very big multiple site operation. The main factors that increase the price are higher quality gear, which you'll probably never regret, and difficult installation challenges, which we've seen plenty of before and we've never been beaten by one yet. Don't waste money by getting the cheap knockoffs, you'll only regret it later. You probably don't need a monitor, and you definitely don't need a PTZ unless you're wanting to show off.